Abundance is about the promise of a better, faster, fairer America through bold public investment. But getting there requires more than big laws. It takes local capacity, political will, and the ability to turn ambition into action. In this episode, I sit down with Brian Regli, a former top advisor in Governor Josh Shapiro's administration in Pennsylvania, a pivotal state where national ambition meets local complexity. We talk about what it's like to be on the inside of a purple state government, translating federal policy into tangible progress. Brian shares the realities behind the rhetoric where success hinges not just on funding, but on local know-how and consensus. Together, we explore what a Project 2029 agenda could look like in a leaner, more fractured political landscape, how we align supply and demand, reform permitting and procurement, and empower local institutions to deliver. Because abundance doesn't happen on paper, it happens in the places willing and ready to build. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. You have a PhD. And
Yes, I do.
you've also worked in real estate and the public sector. So you've traversed academia, public, private, and now you're entering this new phase of your career. And I'm curious, how are you thinking about all of those experiences? And is there something that's pulling you towards one sector over another?
Look, for me, it's about building stuff and getting shit done. My family is a family of builders. For many generations, I would show up on construction sites and I would see things being built. Now, my PhD was all on regulatory policy. It all had to do with economics and how capital investments occurred in highly regulated businesses like telecommunications and energy and the like. So the big challenges we're facing right now in infrastructure are ones that I'm familiar with from an academic and public policy perspective. The challenges that intersect energy and consumption are the hardest for us to respond to, especially when it comes to climate change. So for me, I think a lot of my next round of challenges are going to intersect in that space. And that's where I think I'm going to be able to add the most value in the next cycle of my life and career.
Well, this last cycle, you were very much at the center of Pennsylvania's efforts to take federal funding, especially under the Biden administration, and translate that into local reality. I'm curious, at the level you were sitting, so close to Governor Shapiro, what did it take to make that happen?
So when the governor called me after he was elected in 2022 and invited me to take this title, which was Executive Director of Critical Investments, the frame he put around it was, we have more than $20 billion of formula money. There's billions of dollars of additional money. You have been a builder for most of your career. You have worked in politics for me before. You have created these value streams intersecting public and private sector. So help us understand how these funds are best deployed in Pennsylvania. There were a couple different baskets to that. You would have a basket like working with a secretary on additional funds that a program received and then trying to figure out how to make sure that money was spent as quickly and as efficiently as possible. There were competitive grants available. So I had a team that would work with the agencies to come up with responses to those opportunities to then look at things like workforce development or look at tax credit opportunities and create essentially value streams that could be accretive then, to the formula money that we'd received. And then finally, there was an interface with the private sector. A lot of this was partnering with the not-for-profit community, investors or whatever they may happen to be, or universities, trying to create those relationships so that we would make these critical investments happen. Ultimately, I had the blessings of working with a really creative team. We extended that amount of money by a couple $1 billion more beyond the formula money that we received at the beginning. In areas like lead line replacement, broadband, clean energy, decarbonization, we had all sorts of successes.
I'm always curious when funding comes up like this once in a generation, funding with the IRA, the CHIPS Act. There seems to be three buckets that you sort of have to find a Venn diagram overlap of, like development ready projects, projects that have high impact, and then projects that meet the RFP that's being put out by the federal government. So talk me through how you find projects that sort of sit in the middle there, or if you're prioritizing between those three buckets.
So it's a great question. Let's talk about formula money where there are predefined scopes, and then competitive dollars where those scopes are creatively enhanced by local, community, and state interest. So let's take lead line replacement for a good example. Here's where there was a clear need coming out of, the events in Michigan, a sense that we needed to remove lead from all of these communities where lead was just part of the water systems. And there were all sorts of reasons why Pennsylvania would receive over the course of about a 5-year period, about $400 million to go do that in various communities, right? And You could discuss, the health outcomes, which obviously were better, the more lead you can get out. You could discuss the social outcomes. Hey, you can train people to do things they haven't done before and actually save water and resources because you're improving the infrastructure as you go forward. There's lots of reasons why, from a formula perspective, somebody writing that law would say, let's put a bunch of money into lead lines.
Hmm.
The challenge on the local community is, all right, are you ready to do this work? Oh, we want to get rid of the lead lines. That's awesome. Problem number one, as you can imagine, and I know you've done a lot of work in the water industry and water systems, inventory management is not a strength,
No, it's not.
especially not in an urban community like Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or at Dearborn or wherever. So is the money available to find the lead lines? Unfortunately, no. The way the statute was written and interpreted, you can't get the money to do the inspection unless you do the inspection and then get reimbursed for it. This becomes
Hmm.
problematic, right? So now that changed over time. A little bit more flexibility was brought into the mix. There was a sense of what was downstream, but then there's problem number two, which is okay, you start digging up the street and doing all of this lead line work. Sometimes it was done in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And back then, there weren't really standards for the L's and the T's. Oh, I found a city that's willing to figure out where the lead is, found a city that's innovative enough that they can go through the process and actually like make the changes as they go forward. Then you get into legal questions like, okay, now I have to dig up the lateral because the lateral's lead. I got to get into the house. Whose lateral is that? Great policy vision. Let's get rid of the lead, right?
Hmm.
Actual reality, oh my God, this is going to grind. It's going to grind and it's going to grind. So, from where I sat, both as the coordinator of these funds and also as chair of what's called PennVest, which is the infrastructure authority in Pennsylvania that does all of the water and sewer, you have to work with the local communities and transfer best practice. Small communities like Chambersburg, Pennsylvania were ahead of the game. City of Pittsburgh, absolutely ahead of the game. They got there. They knew what they were doing.
Hmm.
By 2022, 2023, they had started this machine in part because the state had put some money into this, right? But then larger cities like Philadelphia and Allentown were falling behind and continue to try to catch up to the Pittsburghs and the Chambersburgs of the world, right? So you're dealing with this very, very broad scope within a state like Pennsylvania of different levels of local capacity. You can write as many checks as you want. The reality is, if you don't have the project, the
Hmm.
stamp from the engineer, the trained workforce, and the actual knowledge of how you want to do what you want to do, nothing will get done. Part of the challenge, I think, for anyone looking back into the last couple of years and then looking forward into the next 4 to 6 years, you're going to have to keep that into account. Even during the Trump administration's changes to these policies, money is still going to flow to these projects in some shape or form. So we're going to
Hmm.
have to continue to learn. We're going to have to continue to build things. We're going to have to continue to like find ways to make lead line replacement better, more efficient, while at the same time dealing with the fact that the political framework that guides these processes is going to change.
Well, it speaks to the importance of the state's role in making sure to build that local capacity. Like you said, it's workforce capacity, it's technical capacity. And
Mhm.
then at the end of the day, it's how are you applying for this funding at a federal level, which is its own skill set. Can you speak to who filled your role or what was the role of
Mhm.
the state before the Biden administration's influx of dollars?
So here's where that second flavor of funding, the competitive funding, differs a little bit, right? In an environment where most of the money that you get from the federal government is formula funds, there are executive agencies at the state level that are responsible and they understand this is a thing you're going to do. We have PennDOT, which is our transportation authority. You're going to get an authorization for roads and bridges. They have state of good repair. They have a backlog of bridges that they need to
Hmm.
do. So there's a machine that's built, right? Part of what happened in the Biden administration was the recreation of certain machines. Now, some may comment and say that those machines were not well designed or well built, but I think many of them were actually well contemplated. By way of example, the Department of Energy got all kinds of new money as a result of the work that happened in the IIJA and the IRA. They had to build new program offices. They then put out competitive solicitations for things that were extraordinarily impactful for the energy industry in particular. And you're dealing with the grid, you're dealing with generation, you're dealing with new types of technologies. At the state level, there weren't necessarily neat categories to drop that money into or train staff that understood how to go after those funds, right?
Hmm.
So we built a team that worked specifically on grid issues. Although the state has capacity in transmission grid and regulatory designs for the energy industry, it doesn't mean that the state has done the kind of comprehensive planning that needs to happen when you start looking at moving billions of dollars of investment into a new high capacity transmission line between the city of Buffalo, the city of Erie, and the city of Pittsburgh, for instance. Those are real world requirements that many state officials are not familiar with because they don't usually have to do that. Because Even though you're getting money from the feds, it doesn't mean that you're allowed to spend it. You can only
Mm.
spend it if the state government accepts the money that the feds are programming. So you have this whole process of alignment between the federal agency, the state agency, the legislators, and then the personnel and the staffing to get it done.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially like you're saying, that locus, because you're
Mhm,
able to see at a regional level and then
mhm,
across state lines when you're sitting in a state office like you were. I
mhm,
want to talk a little bit about the purple nature of Pennsylvania. The
mhm,
project you're talking through, energy, specifically lead line
mhm,
replacement, these seem to be projects that everybody can hop on board, especially because Pennsylvania is such an energy rich state. We have been talking about the Biden administration, and as a
mhm,
Democratic administration transitioning into a Republican administration, and
mhm,
Pennsylvania's pivotal or critical role in how
mhm.
national politics plays out. How do you think about that at a state level? And then at a local level, as you're talking
Mhm,
across all of these projects, how the local politics
mhm.
of the state sort of play into the state's response to projects?
So, the character of Josh Shapiro's administration is one of bipartisanship when possible, right?
Hmm.
And the possibilities that he opens because of the way he leads, I think are much broader than you're going to find in other states. Some of that is out of necessity, but some of that is simply because the mechanisms of government require both parties in Pennsylvania to operate. I can't do something at the county level unless the Republican communities in places like Western Pennsylvania or North Central Pennsylvania are engaged in those projects. One of the smartest comments I heard in the first couple of weeks of my time in the Shapiro administration was from a gentleman named Pat Cicero. He said that Pennsylvanians like to get their energy from the ground rather than the sky.
Hmm.
And culturally, that's kind of true. You have the history of the coal industry, you have the history of the natural gas and oil industry. It's extraordinarily common, for local communities to understand resource extraction. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are comfortable with the idea that fracking companies may not be disclosing the chemicals that they're using. By the same token, there is a sense that this is a world where big spinning turbines from nuclear power plants or gas fired power plants, those are kind of things that people feel comfortable with. In other communities in the United States, they might not feel comfortable with that. They may feel more comfortable with, wind. They may feel more comfortable with solar. For
Hmm.
me, projects like what we sort of constructed with the Environmental Protection Agency's funding under the Inflation Reduction Act was a really good example. We have a program that just started called the RISE PA program, run by a great program manager named Louis Crack. And Louis out there pitching industrial decarbonization. We received about $400 million from the EPA to talk to places like US Steel and say, hey, you know what? If you need additional capital to reduce your emissions by more than 20%, we can help you offset that risk. So
Mhm.
here's a very interesting and ironic intersection, right? Hey, US Steel wants to upgrade their facilities in the Mon Valley. And wouldn't it be really good if we could all be part of that? And since this is money that's already gone through Congress and been programmed, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has developed this program in alignment with US Steel, we all should be able to work towards, because not only is it better for the local community, it's going to reduce emissions. And ultimately, cleaner energy is better than dirtier energy. There are Republicans that I have worked with in Harrisburg that are absolute deniers of climate change, but yet would agree that cleaner energy is better than dirtier energy. So let's lean into that consensus.
Mhm.
Ultimately, irrespective of the politics, you don't build anything in this country or frankly any place in the world without the local community being involved. You just can't do it. You just can't show up and say, hey, by right zoning, I can build, 20 stories of an apartment complex here, go pound sand. It doesn't work that way. The question is about how we achieve social capital, the social capital required for consensus, so that we can say yes to important things that supply what we need for the future development of the country. Ultimately, if communities say no to everything, none of us are going to get ahead. We all have to figure out how to say yes to the thing that our community can contribute. And this is the beauty of the American system. I'm not concerned about our ability to innovate. I'm concerned about our ability to reach consensus and define that ability to say yes to things.
Mm. In terms of reaching consensus, which I think is sort of this overarching idea of Pennsylvania is a purple state. Before we get into how consensus plays into the long pre development timeline of projects, which we've been hearing a lot about in
Right.
California and New
Mhm.
York, I would love to hear you sort of play that out and how Pennsylvania hasn't really come to mind when people have talked about the long pre development timeline for projects. And maybe this culture around consensus in Pennsylvania lends itself to that.
We as Pennsylvanians have not been doing a good enough job selling ourselves as a community that is ready-made for those kinds of consensus opportunities. What you need are people that are willing to say yes to things and folks who can shepherd you through that process. So I think that Pennsylvania is a bellwether of what the country can become. There are spaces that open up in Pennsylvania that allow Republicans and Democrats to talk in ways that don't happen in other parts of the nation. That's not because other parts of the nation aren't as interested in the conversation. It's because we actually have to live with it every day. We are one of the most divided states. We will likely be that way for at least another generation. It's not really sort of the swing state thing because every moment is a swing moment. Where are you starting from? There is probably some ideological predisposition you have for or against the thing that I'm talking about right now. That's a moment where somebody says, you know what? Maybe if your school put a whole bunch of solar panels on top of the roof and you use the tax credits that are available under the Inflation Reduction Act, that application is fine. I just don't want to see solar on a farm. And guess what? I probably would agree with you. And I know the Secretary of Agriculture in Pennsylvania would likely agree with you too, because you don't want to use up agricultural lands for things that could be better served for other productive purposes. So these are the kinds of conversations you need to have, right? It's the swing moment where you say, don't criticize the technology. Think about the application and think about what you're willing to say yes to relative to the application.
Can you talk a little bit about a project that you have seen sort of go through this arc and provide a little bit more tangibility to the types of consensus building, but also the technology agnostic side to the problems you're solving when it comes to infrastructure delivery?
So I'm going to stick with solar for a couple seconds because it's essential to our energy independence, the stability of our grid, and the ability to manage processes that relate to the growth of data centers and other types of consumption, right? Pennsylvania has a lot of abandoned mine lands. Most of those mine land environments have acid mine drainage, which is going to require us literally in perpetuity to make sure that all of the stuff that leaches out of the mine lands are gathered, and then we deal with water remediation and purification so that we can make sure that plants grow, animals can drink, and hunters can hunt the ecosystem we have to create. They gave us a lot of money under the IIJA to accelerate that because ultimately the coal industry is not going to be around forever. They know that. Our goal is to get all of that water system improvement in place in Pennsylvania over time. As part of that, you end up with excess land. Why not put solar panels on them? So there are companies, for instance, in Western Pennsylvania that have already started installations. So it's not like we're taking agricultural land or anything like that. And what you're doing is you're integrating the solar array with the water reclamation issues, right? So now they can literally turn that cycle around and say, fine, I'm providing lower cost electricity to low income customers because we're generating power. We can now replicate that and use land that has been fallow because of the nature of Pennsylvania's historical experience in mining. We have literally hundreds of thousands of acres in Pennsylvania of abandoned mine lands. We have an inventory of about 100,000 acres that we control in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So who should we be talking to? The coal companies, the natural gas industry. They also spend money on utilities. So intersecting those points, right? Seeing those projects move. My hope is that in the next couple of years, the mining companies and the advocacy organizations and the federal government with the funds they've given us, they say, wow, this is exactly what we need to do more of in Pennsylvania. And we should be doing it in West Virginia. And we could do it in Tennessee. We could do it in Wisconsin. And we could do any place that there's been mining operations. That's the world that we want to live in, where we think about recycling these ideas, reinventing these ideas, and propelling them.
I want to talk about the last sort of political theory rhetoric that has been going around, especially as it relates to infrastructure delivery. And it's been coined by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson under this abundance title. What you're talking about is building consensus by bringing together parties and how Pennsylvania might be more inclined to build consensus, whereas policies that have been put in place in maybe more left-leaning states have tried to formalize what a consensus building process looks like, and to build consensus by requiring projects to do a little bit for everyone, as opposed to having some of these deeper conversations that you're alluding to with people who sit on opposite sides of the aisle. I'm curious, when you couch it under the criticism of these infrastructure projects for taking too long and becoming too expensive to deliver, and what we call this abundance framework, what about what Pennsylvania is doing speaks to that? And what about it sort of rebutes that
Well,
argument.
so let's define terms to start with, right?
Sure.
And what I'm going to do is, even though I love Esther Klein's writing, I'm going to start with Derek Thompson. He spends a lot of time talking about why Democrats cannot do supply effectively anymore, right?
Mhm.
And this is the main insight that I get out of the book. You can write a check for housing, you can write a check for insurance, you can write a check for whatever it may happen to be, and you're focusing on the demand side. But if you create more demand without increasing supply proportionally, all you're doing is raising prices. And the costs and the prices have elevated. And I think it would be irresponsible not to recognize the impact, right? So now when you're in a world where demand is the pump you've been pushing, now you got to figure out how to deal with supply. The things that we can do better, that we can control at the state level in supply, is obviously permitting, the business constraints, the ability to find ways to get to yes more quickly. Let's talk about broadband for a second. Oh my God, was it horrendously bureaucratic? There was this thing called the Alternative Connectivity Program, the ACP, which was basically a demand side incentive that was really pushed during the pandemic. We provided a check of about $75 a month to like low income communities, individuals, so that they could help pay for broadband, right?
Mhm.
That's demand side. That went away. We have all this capital money that should be deployed to improve the supply side. More broadband, cheaper, more infrastructure, rural communities. We're not doing the supply side right, and we've lost the demand side.
Hmm.
So we may end up with the worst of both worlds over the next couple of years. We're going to have to figure out, did we get anything out of the demand side during the pandemic? And can we get anything out of whatever's left on the supply side? What the abundance agenda really should be about is aligning those two, supply side, demand side, finding the right technologies that promote cheaper supply, the right processes at the state level, the right, categorical exemptions for certain types of permitting procedures, while at the same time really focusing on what the entitlements need to be so that people can get the basics, right?
Mm.
Be it housing, be it broadband, be it insurance. And someplace we've got to work to meet in the middle. That can't be engineered by the federal government. It can only be engineered in local communities, in regional collections of resources and capabilities, and it's going to be different in different states.
Hmm.
So you can't be in a position where you sit in Washington and impose upon Alabama and Utah and Pennsylvania and New York and Maine and Michigan the same solution, because
Mhm.
ultimately each of those states is going to have a different way to articulate what
Right.
it means to them to really deal with universality and broadband.
So when we are talking about these large, let's say, resource bills at the federal level that were coming
Right.
through,
Mhm.
and your role was to sort of do the matchmaking between projects and money. Now that
Yep.
that money is dwindling and you're talking more about the policies that need to help align supply and demand, do you see the role of the state shifting to accommodate that approach?
I think the states
Yeah.
that do that more quickly are going to have advantages, and the communities that they serve will have advantages. The opportunity exists to program the dollars that are already in the system, which generally take years to get
Right.
out, right? As long as the federal government does not fall apart,
Mhm.
or frankly, if somebody else shows up in 2029 and has to rebuild it and successfully rebuilds enough capability to continue to deploy money and continue to move things in ways that would be relevant, useful, by law, there's still a lot to be done. And the private sector also has an extraordinary amount of resources that it wants to invest in infrastructure projects. And this is the
Right.
challenge. Government can and should own and manage large scale projects in certain circumstances, be they sewer systems, be they water systems, in some cases, even working to have hospitals or care facilities. By the same token, that doesn't prevent you from having private investment that would be required for transmission lines, data centers, or charging stations, whatever they may happen to
Mhm.
be. So there's always going to be a mix between the private and the public sector. I'm hopeful that during this process, when people lose what they have, which is dangerous and frustrating, they also begin to realize why government exists. We're here to help solve the collective action problem. We're here to try to
Mhm.
manage these resources as best we can. So guess what? Maybe we do have to raise taxes on the rich, but we can't raise taxes on the rich unless we're willing to say the government also needs to be fixed and we need to manage it differently. And we can't disenfranchise local communities by requiring them to do things that they don't want to do,
Mhm.
and create pathways that allow them to do the things that they are willing to do.
Mhm.
You need local movements. Now, here's the good news. in American history, there's great precedent for this. If you go back to the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, we're healing from the Civil War. We are going through some really difficult moments in the Gilded Age and the separation of wealth that becomes extraordinary. But at the same time, it was literally communities that created rural electric cooperatives. Electricity was never about Edison and Tesla from the top down, although there was a lot of that with companies like Westinghouse. We in the United States are used to doing bottom up. So how do you use bottom up over the next couple of years so that people are ready for an environment where the next generation of leadership might be able to free up these resources again? That's the hope I live with every day, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately, we need to replenish our local resources and our local social capital and try to have those conversations about the things that we want to do.
I've worked in communities where the local government has not been as strong or bold or visionary. And you've seen that vacuum of power or resource creates a space for the third sector, the private sector sort of step in. And what the public sector is really good at is this balance between short-term and long-term priorities, but also priorities between different types of constituents that maybe the private sector or the third sector is not as aligned with, I would say.
No, so I agree with this, but let me shoot something back at you. We're in an environment where it's hard for a politician to focus on running the government when they're too busy seeking attention from the social medias and the fundraisers and the check writers and things like that. It becomes this difficult tension between the institutionalists that have to run the government with the political leadership and the political engines built these days on this seemingly endless supply of the outrage machine that create the chaos that says, no, you can't say yes to these people and you can't talk to them. How dare you have a conversation? Just by talking to these people, you're morally compromised. I can't live in that world because ultimately nothing that we do that's complicated and hard is only going to involve a narrow constituency. It's going to involve multiple constituencies. And the political leadership, the maturity needs to kick in. And some of this is just finding the mature leaders that are able to rise above the politics of the moment and recognize the fact that the institutional priorities are being forgotten.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Do you see that sort of immaturity happening at the local level as much as it's happening at a state or federal level?
Occasionally, you can walk into a county in Pennsylvania, and most counties by our constitutional structure have two of the majority and one of the minority as commissioners, right? There is some level of minority representation. And even in a county, you're going to have townships where it's a majority of one party to another, right? So you're always on a knife's edge, and you're always thinking about what these alignments need to be on pretty much any issue. Some people are more mature than others. And just to take it down to humanity, right? Some people are more self-aware than others. Some people are in politics because the dopamine hit involved in, feeling good about themselves and everybody saying that they're really smart. Some people believe that the exercise of power is a social responsibility. They have decided to take that on with the honest good graces, irrespective of party, that say, I need to help the staff run this government. That's what a politician is for, is to say, here's what the voters need based on what I think they need. And here's how I can help you do your job so that you can actually do what the voters want you to do. So wake up every morning and make that your priority in a world where every other bit of attention and structure is drawing you away from it is really, really hard.
I want to go back to this optimism that you're expressing, that in the void of federal funding and resources, there'll be more grassroots and local buildup of projects and consensus around things that the community themselves wants to prioritize. And I feel like this could go one of two ways. Like, yes, we could build that local resource hub of all these different stakeholders coming to play, or we could be seeing municipalities and political leaders say, let me use emergency powers to cut the need for the local capacity building and make this process even easier for us to get through. And in reading Abundance, Derek Thompson, Ezra Klein, point to a few cases in which international global crises drive projects forward under the preamble of emergency powers. In light of not having resources and being able to cut processes in half or reduce costs, do you see that the use of emergency powers being extended is a pathway forward?
The question really in terms of emergency powers is you were saying, guess what? The rewards are too important. None of the risks matter. But that's not the mature way of doing it, right? And I'm just going to drive 180 miles an hour down the highway and goddamn the consequences. You can't do that. But there are times that you can change the accelerator and you can change the speed and you can change the cadence. So we use the emergency clause too often. Maybe what we're doing is we're taking away some of the restrictions, taking away some of the bureaucracy. And now we can, at the state level, make our state bureaucracy a little bit better, right? Now we can sort of pare down the requirements at the state level and say, fine, there's emergencies. There's not quite emergencies, but things that we need to do quickly. And then there's things that are going to take time. But once you start going down that process and saying, well, it's an emergency and therefore everything is an emergency, the muscle memory in government and in the private sector to actually learn how to do that well is never going to happen. It's like saying, I'm going to take a whole bunch of drugs and lose weight, but I'm not really going to exercise. I'm still going to sit in my chair and eat Cheetos. That's the world that we want to live in, where we are eating well, we are exercising, we are building things, we're doing things that are good together. And it's not like we're on a sudden crash diet because we think we need to lose whatever or gain whatever.
I'm curious, as you are looking forward and projecting what a Project 2029 might include, how do you balance that sort of state rights, local need, and wants for their own projects with a national policy agenda that more people can get behind?
I think Democrats and progressives will recognize the value of federalism, and it works. It doesn't work perfectly, but it works. There's going to have to be a high degree of variability in the implementation of certain types of policies. I actually think the easier way to think about it is if the Trump administration breaks the federal bureaucracy or really restricts its ability to function, we could probably spend 4 years simply vacuuming up all of the quarters, nickels, and dimes and dollars and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars that they've all left on the table that are sitting in the laws that have yet to be programmed. That's the reality. It's not like they can take the money away unless the Supreme Court says something different, right? You're going to have one group of people that's going to fix the government and try to get all that money moving. You're going to have to deal with tax policy. It's about making sure the government is sufficiently resourced and, frankly, focus on that for 4 years. I know that sounds horrendously simplistic. I know that's hopeless because everybody's going to want to have a signature program that does X, Y, and Z. Frankly, I think the tax code and tax equity is enough of a signature item that's a worthy generational battle that should be had in 2029. But as a consequence of that, you still have to go through the exercise of saying, what are the policy areas that we can reconstruct that take the learnings from the local and state community and then articulate themselves in concrete programs that are already within the budget constraints that exist? Because there's a lot of this that can be done with the funding we already have, as long as we are creative and focused and take away some of this bureaucracy and overhead and really try to turn ourselves into people that manage the bureaucracy. But I believe that there is a world of shared sacrifice. We do these things not because they're easy. We do them because they are hard. Let's all recognize that fact, and let's all give each other some grace about that fact. And let's actually look at the problem. If it's building a water system, a bridge, improving broadband, or creating enough energy for the local community, say yes to something. What can you and your community do at the local level that's tangible and real and delivers value, not just to your community, but to communities around you? And don't do that, within the bounds of only the ideological friends of ours or the people who should benefit from the things that we work on, because that is the mentality that, frankly, has been infused from this generation into the political system in a way that needs to change.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.